It's amazing. Recording in progress, yes. I just want to say that the book is amazing. My short review is it's very easy to read and really reads like a memoir, which I really enjoyed instead of like really heavy policy or analysis. So I would recommend it, but we're going to talk more about it and all of Suchitra's experiences. I think you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, before we get started. So let's start off with something like really broad. The first question I have for you is, most of us probably know that South Asian borders have really violent histories rooted in colonial legacy, the Radcliffe Line, Duran Line, there's so many more that you mentioned in your book. How did you pick which borders to report and focus on?
Right. Initially, the idea came from, this was initially a photography project and what I really wanted to, and not as a book project. And the reason why it was a photography project, I feel, was like 10 years ago, I also felt very afraid of being a writer and someone. I'm a lawyer by training, and I say this to Maitri all the time, to be a journalist and report from some of these communities is incredibly hard. Anyone can parachute in, but to do the kind of reporting that good journalists do is incredibly hard. So when I was thinking of the project almost 10 years ago when it first started, I just wanted to travel through the entirety of the land border and kind of make this as a visual conversation about what's happening. And I did travel the entire 9,000 mile of the border. And of course, it was easier to travel the India-Bangladesh border and actually trace the porous routes much easier. And of course, this became impossible with the border with China, the one with, especially with Kashmir, and also, of course, the western border with Pakistan. So I traveled the entirety of the border, but towards the end, when I started writing the book, as I say in the book, some of the people, and I wrote this research and wrote this book over a period of 7 years, which meant that over the course of the 7 years, India also became an incredibly violent place. And a lot of the communities that I interviewed, I spent time with, not only faced historic violence of the partition and other violence, but also became communities that became targeted for immediate and present violence, whether it's Kashmir, whether it is communities in Nagaland, whether it is in Manipur, even communities in Gujarat, where increasingly nomadic tribes were being persecuted, because a lot of these nomadic tribes were also they didn't quite fit into the state narrative. So what you really have in the book is a fraction of all of the stories that we have. And I also had to let go of the stories because it became incredibly unsafe to write and report. In some cases, if you'll notice, we've kept the name, the geography itself, while you name the region, the actual towns are not very specific. And when anonymity became very difficult, we let go of stories. So some ways, even putting together this book was an act of various kinds of resistance. So what you really see is a fraction of the book, but in reality, the project started as my travel through these 9,000 mile border.
Yeah, I think a lot of journalists, most journalists probably can relate to the fact that you have to let go of narratives, certain stories for so many reasons, largely safety. I know that during my time reporting in Bangladesh, I had a lot of those, and I have a little folder where I have these like stories and recordings and stuff, and like someday maybe there'll be something or nothing. But well, is there like a specific account that, I mean, obviously keeping sources anonymous and all that you want to talk to that like has really stayed with you? I mean, 7 years is a long time, so I'm sure you have tons, but it's like something that a person or a community or something that really, you remember often.
You talk about someone from the book or someone who didn't make the book?
Someone who didn't make the book. Sorry, yeah.
Didn't make the book. Okay. That's a long list. But I think I'll talk about the border with Pakistan, but also the border that the in Gujarat when I traveled. Gujarat doesn't appear in the book at all for various reasons. This had to do with the fishing community, which often has fishermen who get caught within the international waters and then get picked up. Many of them have languished in prisons for years. And this was a story of a very young boy many, many years ago, who found himself stranded on the Indian side. He was from a fishing community in Pakistan, but found himself on the Indian side of the border in Gujarat, particularly. The thing is that nobody intercepted this boat. He was all of 12 when he found himself on this border. And he kind of just ended up staying back. The police didn't find him. He never got picked up. Most of the cases, these fishermen do get picked up. And he made a life for himself in these communities. And in some ways, he changed his name. He changed. This was a very painful story because he started telling me about how he started changing everything else about him. He had to come up with a new story because he was very afraid, because he knew of stories of men in his own community who had gone fishing and would get caught by the Indian Coast Guards and then get picked up and then spend the next 20, 30, 40 years in the Indian prison. And this happened in Pakistan as well. Indian fishermen would get. So these stories are very much alive in his mind. And then so once he finds himself, and again, he was not intercepted, he was not arrested, he was just a young boy roaming around. And so he starts to give himself a new name, a new story, a new background. And, he has his family here. And what's really interesting is that he's done this for over 30 years now. And when we were having this conversation almost 5 years ago, he said, I've told these stories about my life to myself and others over and over again, that now I don't remember the real me, the young boy as I came in. And this was also a story of environmental destruction. You saw how Gujarat was used as a place for Narendra Modi to talk about development. The development model of India was somehow pitched to the rest of India when Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat. But in reality, what you really see is that, as usual, it was the rich and those on the top who actually benefited, and the actual development model was both has fumbled and fallen down. My dear friend M. Rajshekhar wrote a brilliant book called Despite the State that actually documents what happened in Gujarat. What you really saw was small businesses ran out, but also the story of environmental degradation, where increasingly the state started seeing people and land as a way to acquire abuse for the benefit of much larger, bigger businesses. You saw how malnutrition was something that was there. So this was a story of both retelling your history in such a way that you forget who you are, but also a story of so many things about development, about the trickle-down economy, about a very what aggressive nationalism can do to communities, but also the real victims of course, always being the people who never have had access to power. So this story never made it because finally he felt very uncomfortable and he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure if telling the story was the right time. So that story, there's nothing on Gujarat. The Gujarat chapter doesn't exist. I had to pull it off 3 or 4 months before the final manuscript was locked.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What made you pull that? Because I would think, especially with who's in power right now, it would be a really interesting chapter for the book.
One of the things I did with the writing of the book is often I would send back transcripts and finished chapters to those who I was still in touch with and make sure that they were comfortable. I made the people that I interviewed collaborators in this process. And sorry, did I go out? Sorry.
No.
And I know this is not something that journalists do, but I wasn't also a journalist. I wasn't trying to only tell a journalistic reported story. And I read the story back to him with the help of a translator. And initially he said yes. And towards the end, and he came back and he said he wasn't sure anymore. Initially he agreed to having his name changed, but then he felt that because he was such an ambiguous figure, that if the story came out, it wouldn't be difficult to identify who he was. And when he finally said, this is not the time, maybe, a few years from now, you will do a reprint of the book, but right now I just don't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And this was just months before. This was around the time when the citizenship laws were again being promulgated, just before the protests. And it was already a pretty intense time in India.
Yeah.
So when he felt so unsure about, again, as I say, I mean, not all stories have to be shared.
Yeah.
And it was his story. And when the person who you have built a relationship with through this act of conversation refuses to have this conversation with you, or refuses and decides this is not the time to have the conversation, it was important that we let go of this conversation. So and this is not the only one. A lot of other stories similarly, the India-China border similarly is very sparse. Again, for the same reason, we had to take out people from that book. So yeah, so definitely it was, as I said, it was an act of community. And if the people I spoke to didn't want to be a part of the book, then it only felt right to respect their wishes.
And I know that in the intro in the book, you say that you made multiple trips to cover all 9,000 miles, is it, of the border. What does it take to get access to? I mean, I imagine, like we were talking about a little bit before the event started, that getting access to like borders and like Bangladesh, India is pretty easy because there is a lot of movement actually between the two countries in that way. But then, like, you know, obviously other parts are much harder. So what are some of the challenges that you faced while trying to get access?
I think one of the things that I did was I did a lot of in-depth research, and often I had existing relationships with people from the region or those communities, either as friends that I knew from before, community workers. Some of them ran NGOs, some of them were local activists, some of them were journalists. So this book would not have been possible without, that's why I call this book as an act of community. And it was in some ways, it was their act of trust that helped the communities that I spoke to open up to me. In some places, also because I kept returning over and over again, I just became familiar. In other communities, the only reason why people spoke to me was because there were others in the community who trusted me and vouched for me, and who then became the interlocutors. So this book would not have been possible without many, many, many of those incredibly important and generous acts. Another thing was that also I didn't look anything like also people didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't really a journalist. I've never really worked as a journalist while I reported for this. I told people I was writing a book. I also had a camera with me. Often I would tell people I'm a lawyer, and people would then come with me with their legal documents and ask for legal advice. And sometimes that was also a way, though I never worked on these things, you know, I could do simple legal advice. You know, you can go do this, you can go do that. Sometimes I would help draft legal petitions for people, or I would help draft letters for the local administrator. So in that sense, also my skill as a lawyer really helped, because then the community, once the community comes to you and says, hey, can you help me with this? And you do help them, and you try to help them in as many ways, then that's also an act of trust. So I think this happened in many, many ways, but also there's sometimes when people didn't want to speak to me, rightly so. Why would they want to speak to me? And in those places, I very politely just withdrew, and I didn't push for it, because end of the day, it's important to do this with the people who want to do this. And it's very easy for many of us who come from immense privilege to parachute into communities and demand that people open up their doors, their stories. I definitely never tried. I didn't want to do that. So.
And you stayed always on the Indian side, right? Had you crossed over? I feel like you did, but I'm not exactly sure. Like,
with Bangladesh, I did, but again, it was not.
It's not
I was mostly on the Indian side.
Yeah.
Bangladesh was easy. With others, it was impossible. Of course, in Nagaland, I crossed by mistake. I was caught on the other side because. But I was mostly trying to stay within the Indian side.
Yeah.
And I was also and also the book was very much a critique of the Indian nation state.
Right.
So also I think at some points in time I ran out of money. So
yeah, that's a big one. That's pretty important. You know, as I was reading the book, I was noting, like, little demarcations of the border, right? Like there's like the very heavily militarized, like Pakistan, Indian border, right? That we see everywhere. We see in the movies, we see in photos, we see in a lot of pop culture, right? In a lot of South Asian pop culture. But then there are things like in Panitar, in the border of India and Bangladesh, there's a 1 foot high concrete block that is used as a cricket stump, right? And it's like literally sounded like it's just like through a lane, right? Like that, like houses on either side of the border, which is this little block of concrete. And then also I think the Kotwali Darwaza, which is it's just an old fort, right? And like I would love to have seen that. Like that just sounds like such a cool thing to see. But like, what other ways have you seen borders being marked, sort of officially and unofficially?
For me, what's really interesting was how the border was unmarked.
Yeah.
Even when it exists. And I think that was the more subversive part of this. The markings of the border become more and more tangible, right? For example, the India-Bangla border, which was porous for the longest of time, which literally had communities that were together, becoming more militarized. Even parts of Northeast, whether it's Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, all of these spaces are again increasingly being militarized. So in that sense, the wall in some ways is always being constructed. They are constructing them as militarized fences. They're constructing them as creating these little gates. But what's interesting is how are people undoing them? And the unmaking happens. There's a really great video that someone sent me last year. Was these group of these elephants just completely destroying the border between the new border fence between border fence in Mizoram, and just walking through.
Yeah.
Another thing that you really see is also how communities in the borderlands also help those who are fleeing in acts of community, because for them, it's not an act of striving for a better life. Is not, these communities don't see the striving for a better life as an act of criminality. I think those were something that you regularly see. Border pillars would become stumps. I also saw these decaying fences would be used to dry clothes, or women would, again, it's very interesting because these regions, you realize that because it's wetland and then the water kind of comes in and goes, metal gets completely eroded. And you would see these women then use these wire metals and meshes and repurpose them for something else. So what you really saw was people then dismantling these various border markers and border pillars through just the act of living.
Yeah.
Just the act of living as an act of resistance. And I think that was something I also wish that had more space in the book, but I think that for me was really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that when I was traveling in Bangladesh. I mean, it's so easy. I felt like anywhere you went, you just oh, there's India right there across, you just look at it, and truly that's how it was.
Yeah.
When I was traveling on a lot of the Chars, the river islands, literally just look over there, and every time I went, I would some old person would tell me, oh, actually my grandfather's from over there. It's so arbitrary, these borders. And one of the things that I experienced a lot, and you talk about a little bit, and I think in the book too, is cross-border marriages, right? Cross-border marriages are so common because like you said, these borders are so irrelevant to a lot of these communities. And when I was covering the Rohingya refugee community, they've been coming since the 70s, but even earlier actually. And often the older refugees would tell me stories about how, we would come all the time to Bangladesh, from Rakhine State, from Myanmar. We would trade, we would come visit people that we knew. We would often get our daughters married here because communities just overlap. And that is also why, right, that is the point of contention also with their citizenship. But anyway, but with that comes a lot of gender violence comes a lot of young girls are used to smuggle things, and you talk a lot about that in your book too, about smuggling cough syrup and other things. So yeah, what was talk a little bit about that, because I just thought that was really interesting.
I think you've brilliantly outlined both of this, right? One is that the history of South Asia as a frontier and not as a nation state has a longer historical memory. For me, when I was in Paktika province in Afghanistan, almost every household had an Indian bride but then again, they didn't think of it as an Indian bride, right? It's very common. It was always very common for Afghan men to travel across the subcontinent, whether it was north to Kashmir, into Pakistan, or even all the way into India, to find wives and bring them back home. And that was true of all of these communities. What I really was very surprising for me to find is also that how, starting with the early 70s and even kind of increased through the 80s, was that Bangladeshi women would travel all the way from villages in Bangladesh. In Ali's story, you say Kay coming very close to the border, but she also has a sister who travels all the way from one end of the subcontinent to Gujarat, all the way, migrating across the continent to be married off. Again, you saw a lot of these women going to Uttar Pradesh, going through Hyderabad. So women just traveled across, and they still continue to. In some cases, families set them up as marriage proposals, but also often cases, it becomes an act of trafficking. But again, when I say trafficking, I don't want this to be, it's a very, sexual violence against women is very layered and complicated. It's not that only women who are trafficked face sexual violence. Women face sexual violence in the subcontinent across many, many communities, simply by the act of existing as women. And also, it was very difficult to talk about acts of sexual violence because in Ali's story, he doesn't explicitly say something happened to her. Yeah. We know something happened. We don't know what happened. We know that his wife starts crossing the border regularly to smuggle small items like cough syrup and fake Reebok shoes. And she does this for a while. And then one day she comes back home with bruises all over her face and body, but he doesn't explicitly say what happened to her. And also it became very difficult for me from an ethical point of view to actually, I don't know what happened because he never told me what happened. Yeah. All we know is conjecture, right? Because women in the community then start talking and, we don't know what really happened, but we know something happened. So it's also very difficult to get communities to talk about sexual violence. Similarly, in the Pakistan border, Sari Begum also talks about the violence. She says how her husband hit her for the first time and then starts hitting her again because he realized that he liked it. He just realized that he liked hitting her and he starts doing that. And also the way women narrate histories of sexual violence. It's everywhere. Every female character who appears in the book either has history of personally facing some kind of violence or has a family history of sexual violence that then completely alters everything else. So that was it was hard. It's also really hard for us because as women, we see this kind of violence in our homes as well. Yeah. It's not that it only happens somewhere else. It happens in our homes. We hear these stories of maybe perhaps something that happened to our grandmothers, our aunts, but we really never call it sexual violence because we are a culture of shame. Yeah. So it was really hard to talk about this and also document this. But yeah, definitely, as you rightly said, it's both.
This reminds me of the very, very first story I did on, and a lot of my focus was gender issues. And the story it was about a camp of widows in the Rohingya refugee camp. And I had a huge part of the story where I basically reported on the fact that there is no language in the Rohingya dialect for a lot of female body parts, for rape, for sexual violence. And my editor, who had never been to South Asia, who just, doesn't really know much about, didn't know much about this community or this topic, took the entire thing out. And I fought through drafts and drafts, and lo and behold, I promise you, and I talk about this so often, people who know me will know, because it's just one of those things that just kills me. Maybe a couple of days later, I think it's the Language Without Borders, that organization, I believe, or something. I'm
Words Without Borders.
Yeah, Words Without, yeah. So they launched a report about how exactly this, about how it was so hard after 2017 with the largest exodus to actually document what happened to these women, because through interviews, because they couldn't describe it. Everything was there's a word for it, and that also crosses into Bangla, but it just means violence, but not particularly sexual violence, right? And yeah, and that was such a major a part of the story that I had reported, because innately, just because of who I am and what community I'm from, I understood that this was such a hard thing for these women to not only express, but that they never had the opportunity, and that there is no language for them to express that, right? And so I'm sure when you were reporting and writing and pitching this book too, right? Because that's a whole big ordeal. How did you tackle that? Did you write for a Western audience, a global audience, or did you who was your audience, and what were some of the challenges in figuring, or not? Maybe you knew exactly who you wanted this book to be for.
Oh no. I am absolutely clueless. I'm actually very wary of people who early on tell you they know exactly what they're doing.
Right.
Or
it's always
come with a plan. Because, writing about our communities, our homes, our families is so difficult. It's difficult because, one, we come from a community. And I'm talking about, I'm doing broad stroke generalizations, is that South Asian communities generally tend to be a community of shame and consequence. So often, the way even stories are told to us is always told in ways in which what's happening, but you're also, and I grew up bilingual. Both my parents come from different castes, classes, speak different languages. So even the way that I think of English it's somewhere between, in my head, it's a mix of thinking and writing in English, but also kind of borrowing from the syntax of Tamil and Telugu and other languages that I'm other language cultures that I'm part of. First I didn't know what I was doing. And it was very difficult to write and pitch this book. And this is one anecdote that I always say is, I was meeting with someone, an agent, and then this person said, "Oh, I see your book as a cross between Eat, Pray, Love and Passage to India." And
that is the furthest thing from Eat, Pray, Love. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous.
I just sat there going, who am I writing for, right? This is, I thought my first response was, are you sure you're meeting with the right author? Maybe there is another Eat, Pray, Love meets Passage to India.
Oh my God.
And second, I was just, and then another agent told me that, that I don't put myself into the book. He wanted a lot of me in the book. And he also said, I really want you, when I'm reading the book, I want to feel like you're whispering to. I'm like, why would you want the woman that you want to represent to whisper into your eyes? And in that sense, I think it was hard. And for anyone who wants to write a book, I also see that Anjali is in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I always read Anjali's interviews as well as the ways in which she wrote this book. And I also have a book next to me, so I'm also going to do that in case you haven't bought it. Please go get Anjali's book. Anyways, the point is that this is an experience that a lot of us face. If you choose not to be that singular brown voice that wants to talk about everything to an American audience, it's going to be incredibly hard for you to pitch your book, get your book accepted. I think eventually I got very lucky. I got lucky with an agent who understood what I wanted to do. I got lucky with both my US editor and my India editor, who both were not only good editors who made this book infinitely better, but also fought for the book. When I said I would only use Indian administered Kashmir, and they said yes. This is more so with the India editor because it's harder for her.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I got very lucky as a first-time writer, but it also took me a really long time. Before I got lucky, I was repeatedly told that this book could never be sold. I was told that the characters in my book are too eloquent. I was told that
even though you're obviously translating from multiple, whatever language that these people are speaking into English.
So there was this incredible, in my first draft of my proposal, I'd just done one of my first interviews, and that line that stays with me is, the person in the book says, when someone asks my name, I tell them that I'm someone who's lost my home many times over. Beautiful, poetic, but not uncommon in our languages.
Yeah.
People speak like that.
Yes.
But this person, this agent that I was speaking to, told me that this doesn't sound like somebody who lives in the borderlands. This sounds too eloquent. So it was a struggle in the sense that sometimes, you know this better than anyone else. Like you've actually, I feel like you would have far more stories to tell about this. It's hard. It's hard to sometimes tell our stories without packaging it for an audience, without making ourselves the product, so it's hard. Sometimes you lose out on opportunities, you lose out, but what is always at the end of the day more important is that 20, 30 years from now, I won't be here, but the book will.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, you want to make sure that you spoke to an audience that came from everywhere. Yeah. And I think that was, but we should get drinks and we should all talk about all the other experiences.
Yeah, definitely. So much of that. These languages are thousands and thousands of years old, and it's been changed and refined and updated and, remixed, right? So much, right? So yes, that's definitely something that I also came across. What was it? I was going to say something and then I just totally forgot. But anyway, the language is a big one. I think there's tons of questions for you, but I have more. But as you were pitching this book, but also a question is, what can we learn, right? What can the world learn from India's borders, right? All thousands of miles of it, and how does it, translate across the world? What are the global ramifications? After all these years of reporting, what are some of your takeaways?
I think the crisis of freedom, the crisis of citizenship, the crisis of belonging is not a South Asian problem, it's a global problem. The book starts with the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, but the characters in the book, some of them are from South Asia, but there are others who are not, right? We encounter an African-American soldier in search of his grandfather who served in the 1st African-American battalion to build the Lido Road. You encounter all kinds of people whose history is not, well, their history and memory is local, but every one of our histories is so rich that it's global. Imperial violence shaped not only our homes, but also how we speak, how we call ourselves. And as those of us who have indulged in the act of migration, our histories are not singular. So I think that is the first thing. And I think the second thing is that one thing that you see over and over again, and this specifically so with the India-Bangla border, is that what borders or nation states will your standing army protect when ocean swallows land?
Yeah.
In that sense, global warming is real, climate change is real, which means that how we live as a community is going to change. Even in the United States, during COVID, we really saw the Bangladeshi mutual aid networks in New York come together.
Yeah.
They were organizing, they were taking care of their people. They were creating the community, the rules, the laws, they were taking care of each other. That community of future is already here. And I think it's important for us to keep questioning those things. And I think also the southern border, it's not just the Mexican border is also a story of multiple migrations. It's not just those from, South America. You have Sikh communities leaving India, flying in and traveling through.
There was that little girl that died.
Yeah, Gurpreet's young girl who dies. You also see a lot of Ethiopians coming in. You see all kinds of people leaving their homes in search of a better place. And the reality is that if people think, getting on a boat and putting their children on a boat is safer than the land they stand on, then I think it's very important for us to realize why these lands became so unsafe. And we cannot do that just by talking about South Asian borders. We have to talk about imperial laws and violence and US foreign policy, European foreign policy, ways in which post-colonial states like India have now become, empires in their own right with their project in Kashmir. So I think, as I said, the question of what it means to be free, what it means to be a citizen, questions of belonging, I think those are global questions. I don't think those are not local questions.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, I was thinking about how I learned so much, but then there's so much more I'm now curious about. And that this goes to show there's just so much to probably, there was so much for you to weed out, right, when you were writing this book.
Yeah, but also so much more for all of us to write about, right? It's not just, it's our story of our communities, and I think those are connected, and I think that's what I'm really excited about. I'm excited about what we get to do, not only as individual writers, but as a community. And I think that's exciting.
And I think, growing up I remember when I was reading, studying history in middle school or whatever, I would read my social studies book from front to back. I think this is such a common story of kids who grew up here, and there was that one little section of and Bangladesh was nowhere in it. There was one sentence, but even India, and I would read it over and over and over, and I would go to the library and find books, but they were so dense usually that I read them because I was a nerd, but not everyone would, right? So there will be more books like yours and others that future generations can also refer to and learn.
Yeah. Jen, I feel so old when you say future generation. I feel like
future. You earlier said in 20, 30 years I won't be around. I said, don't you want to make that 50 years at least? So you're dating. We have tons of questions, so I think I'm gonna start with some. We'll go with Anjali first. How did you?
Hey, Anjali.
How did you ensure your own safety on your travels as a woman writer? That is a big question, especially with all these places that you were in.
Okay, so I don't think this book can be written now. I think I wrote the book in a very specific time frame. Even by the time I finished the book, when I started writing the book, I didn't feel unsafe. But as I wrote and I traveled, the last leg of my travel happened in 2018-19. And then by then it became, I physically felt unsafe. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that this kind of a travel now would be impossible for anyone. I'm not for anyone. I'm talking about myself. This kind of travel for me to even go back and recreate would be incredibly hard, which means so much more respect for the journalists, especially the local journalists on the ground in India who continue to do this work. My safety was based on the fact that everywhere I went, the people on the ground always looked out for me. They always protected me, always made sure I was safe. And I don't know why that happened I don't want to also make this into the nostalgia of this, of the subcontinent, because subcontinent is also an incredibly unsafe place. I think one of the things I think it really goes back to the fact that I had help from my friends who were journalists, activists, writers, scholars, who knew their community really well. And I think the respect and the love that they built with their communities made it infinitely easy for me. So this book would not be possible without them. And perhaps that's another reason why the communities I was in always were safe. They were always looking out for me. And I felt that, but towards the end, I think that changed. Towards the end, something else happened. I'm a dark-skinned South Indian woman, and there are no religious markers to me. I could be anything. Usually when I travel, I wear something really baggy and loose. My hair's tied back. I have nothing but sunscreen and lip balm. And so it's very difficult to place caste and class markers to me. Towards the end of the travel, people started actually asking me, are you a Brahmin? What is your caste? What is your religion? And often I had to lie. Mostly I had to lie that I was a Brahmin when I'm not. And I also had to very specifically, especially the people who were traveling with me, or people would very specifically ask, are you Muslim? That became very difficult, because imagine if I was a young Muslim journalist traveling in India. In that sense, I think it's also very important for us to be very specific about the privilege upper caste Hindu Indian woman still has in India. Not that she does not face violence. It's just that if I was a Dalit woman or a young Muslim woman, chances are I wouldn't have made out of any of these situations alive. And that's the reality of it. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that. And I think these are the reasons why I was safe, because I don't think if I did the same thing now, I would be safe. I don't think it was possible.
A lot has changed. A friend, a journalist who I was traveling and working alongside, she's Muslim, she's Bangladeshi, but she wears a bindi, and which is very common in Bengali culture, Bengali, fashion. So we were both wearing, tunics or whatever, and we both had our head covered because it's just hot and it's just what you do there. But she had a bindi. And so a lot of the Rohingya community would ask me often, like, oh, is she Hindu? And it was not, they're powerless. That's the reality. They weren't, and that's a very safe space for people like us. But just the question itself was interesting because she's not, right? And her first name was kind of ambiguous, so she couldn't really tell. But my first name, they didn't question it because I wore a headscarf and I look. They just assumed, that okay, she's Muslim because I don't have any markers. But they would not talk to her. Some of the people would just not talk to her. They would be like, no, and so I asked her once, like, why don't you just go without it? She's like, no, it represents me. There's a lot behind that, being Bengali and Muslim, and how things are rapidly changing. But yeah, it's interesting, even within, right, being the right person, but if you choose to do the wrong thing, it still can be a point of contention. It just reminded me of that story. Okay, question from Mohan. Is the word midnight from the title of the book in reference with the book Freedom at Midnight, 1947 and post-1947 from Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins?
No, the credit for the title goes to my agent, Lucy Cleland, because it's a very difficult book to name. So whether you love it or hate it, it's all Lucy. It's good. It's good. It's Lucy. If it's bad,
just put it on her.
No, because it was a very hard book to name. We didn't know what to name it. And then in one of our conversations, I was telling Lucy about, I grew up as a young person in 90s India, and my father was a child of the Nehruvian era. My father was born in the 50s. And my father had a soft spot for Nehru and would often tell me that Tryst with Destiny speech is one of the greatest speeches in the world. Like, you can't even argue with
A stroke of midnight, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. India awakes to life and freedom.
Yeah, I only know this because of Bollywood. I will preface this by saying that is why I know.
The power of Bollywood, huh?
The power of Bollywood.
So I was telling Lucy about how it's a very, as more time and distance happens between that speech and where India is today, it's a speech that is both incredibly audacious because 500 million people who were less than colonial subjects become independent. An entire subcontinent is made of independent individuals, and yet the very moment the partition happens, the bloodbath happens. And as B.R. Ambedkar, India's the man who gave India her secular, if not revolutionary, the Constitution, talks about how India is going to get into this age where everybody has political freedom, but socially nobody is equal. So midnight, in some ways, it's the moment of also darkness. That acknowledges that not everything was okay, and still everything is not okay. It's a moment of acknowledgement that those farthest away from positions of power are still not equal. Politically, yes, they might be equal, but socially, no. And I think, and then Lucy being Lucy comes back with, why don't we call it Midnight's Borders? I was like, Lucy, people are going to either love it or hate it, and they're going to compare it to Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children.
Yes.
And I was like, and then she's like, well, if people order your book by mistake, it's okay. Rushdie has a lot of, he sold a lot of books. It's okay. We can also get, I'm sorry, I'm being very facetious, but it was the speech. It was more of the speech.
Yeah, no, makes, I don't know, I'm really smart. I picked up on that right away. No, it's because of all those Bollywood movies and constantly seeing the with his hat and all of that. Anyway, I was making light of the situation. Okay, someone asks a pretty loaded question. How do you deal with the ethics of profiting off marginalized people when they've written about photographed communities that are at risk or in the process of being attacked? I think we talked a little bit about that, but if you want to elaborate.
Could you read the question again?
I just want to clarify that I'm not accusing you of doing any of this. This is Nilika, by the way.
Hey, Nilika.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I use my grandfather's name, not my government name, so that I can be anonymous on the internet. So I just want to be clear that I'm not accusing you of that. I'm just trying to find ethical and responsible language for speaking about that, because many, many, many people ask me about that, ask others about that. Why are you photographing this? And there is times when people are being exploitative and running off with the profits. But at other times, this is an ethical life dedication kind of work. But how do you kind of have language to speak about that?
That's a PhD thesis, Nilika. So I'm going to try and be as brief and precise as possible. I think it became very clear early on that this book couldn't just be a book of photographs. We spoke about this early on. This couldn't just be a photography project. This had to be something more. So as I started putting together the book, it became very clear that the people who were part of the book had to be collaborators in the book. So ethically, I made sure that I was always cognizant of where I was in terms of the sheer power I had in relationship to everybody else. So often what I would do is I had to learn on the job because nobody's teaching you all of this, right? Because most places teach you that a good photographer is someone who captures the moment. You shoot, right? Even the way we talk about photographers is about how you talk about photographers like hunters and not as people who are trying to make sense. So visually, one of the things that I did was go back and draw up a framework for myself that I would go back and revise over and over again, just to make sure that whatever I was doing was ethical for me, right? So I had to pass my own test of ethics. That was more than important. That was really important. So it's what Alan Sekula says. Right? Sekula says that the act of representing people on paper is a political act. So the moment you realize that it's not about the moment, it's about a political act of representation. And representation has to come with ethics that are lined up with the people that you're speaking to. So a lot of the images in the book only made it because it had to. There are multiple instances in which I actually didn't photograph. They appear in the book as well. I also made sure that I documented my own ethical dilemmas in the book. There are multiple places in the book where I talk about the struggles that I'm having with that very moment, where I try to photograph something and then the person next to me says, let's not do this, and I don't photograph the thing. So I'm also documenting my own ethical dilemmas in the book. And I try not to act as if I know all the answers. Rather, I try to make sure that I'm constantly making sure that what I'm doing is right. And if I'm not right, then I'm saying that what I'm doing is not right. An example is in one of the books, there's a photograph. And also because I was having these conversations regularly with my editors, I think my editors also became very clear about what I wanted to do. In the India book, for instance, some of the photographs don't appear because my editor actually flagged it, saying that, Suchitra, in this case, we know her name, we know her village. We also now have a photograph. Should we have this photograph in? And immediately we decided we shouldn't, and that image was not there. We took the image off. Second, anything that I put, I made sure with the text that I always went back to the communities. I read texts, I read the transcripts. And as I said, there are moments when people didn't no longer want to be a part of the book, we let them go. But I think this is an ongoing conversation. But in reality, you're right. Often marginalized communities become trauma porn. And it's very important for us to not only point it out and critique it, no matter who does it, but also consistently evaluate what it means to be ethical. And I think that question of ethics is not fixed. I think it's a lot more fluid. I'm sure we can have an entire 6-hour conversation about this, but I hope I've answered some of your questions.
Yeah, and I think as a person in a place of privilege, if you're South Asian American or South Asian, living in a Western country or from a Western country, you're trying to bring these stories to a wider audience, but then you also have editors and, people that don't always understand. And so there's this balance of, we have to make these stories compelling, but then now these stories are compelling and you have to, express that, but also protect the people that you're writing.
Yeah, but also stories are messy and complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
And the word that I really hate there's this one phrase that I hate is human interest. I'm like, what does it mean, human interest? Like, aren't we interesting? Because again, it's not the job. For me, stories are an excellent way to ask questions about our life, about our political universe. For me, stories are not just stories. You don't just say stories. Stories are about our moral, political universe. So the moment you you decide one story is more interesting than the other, you are also creating a certain kind of literary violence, right? Because who gets to make the judgment? I don't get to make the judgment.
Yeah. Right?
Who am I? Like, fine, I put this book. Yes, one could also say putting together a book is an act of judgment. Yes. But that's why, the questions of ethics, the questions of how we tell stories about our communities, it's ethically fluid. You have to constantly keep changing it. I'm sure 10 years from now, a kid who picks up this book is going to pick up this book and find find flaws in this book, and they're going to write about it.
Of course.
And even now, I'm sure there are flaws in this book now, right? But maybe flaws that I don't recognize. But I think as a writer, or even as a person, I think we grow. I would be more interested in the critique of the book, because then it gives me opportunity to become a better writer, right? Then so when someone says, these are the things that you did wrong, then you can take it and you can make something out of it. And we grow and we become richer and we become good critique, good ways that it's fluid. There are things that I did 10 years ago as a photographic practice I would not do today. There are things that I did as a writer 5 years ago that I would not do today. And I think it's okay to be flawed, as long as we understand that the flaw is something that we can fix, but that doesn't also become exploitative. So that's how I would think about these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're out of time, but one more question, because I know this was really, really, really fast. It's a really good question from Shafali. Do you have any sense of the reaction to your book in India? And what was it like working with a US editor and an India editor?
Okay. Yes. The book actually has not been, initially we thought I was going to get charged with sedition. So that didn't happen, which was because we did a legal edit for the book in India. The legal edit came back where the lawyers were like, possible sedition. And I was like, how is saying that BSF is an opaque institution, an act of, and they're like, no. Somebody from an ex-retired BSF battalion could file a suit against you, and simply that's how paranoid publishing is.
Right.
So we initially thought, but then the COVID second wave happened. The books came out in the middle of a devastating second wave. So it's been very difficult to really think about a book when the people you wrote about are also going through another crisis. And none of the mainstream folks in India have touched the book. Some of them have published excerpts. Some of them have published reviews that are blurbs. The more closet right-wing ones have said how, I should respect the soldiers. But it's magazines like The Caravan and Himal, South Asian, who have actually done an in-depth review. So that's a handful. So mainstream has either ignored it or gone out of the way not to talk about this. Having said that, the book is still doing well word of mouth. Every week since the India book has come out, I get messages, emails, letters from my readers telling me about the book. And often what is remarkable for me is how incredibly empathetic and full of love the people of the subcontinent are. I know it's not a good time. I know things are really terrible, but the empathy with which people were willing to engage with the book. Of course, it doesn't mean they agreed with everything, but the empathy to see what everybody else did, that's always been great. In the US, I don't think anyone knows who I am. So it also helps not knowing, and people pick up the book because they found it. So that's been a very interesting experience. My editors, both Orion Harrington at Melville, who's no longer with Melville, and Ajita, who's my publisher, my editor and publisher in India, for context, I was very lucky. I had a lot of shitty early on experiences, but I think they were both very solid editors who came with some very good advice. They understood that this was a very unruly story, and definitely without them, I don't think the book would have the structure it did. I wanted to do too much. And there are times when they'll let me do all the crazy things that I wanted to do with the structure. And there are times when they actually said, not going to work, don't do it. They literally said, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because the book is so dense that we have to keep the language light.
Yeah.
I have a lot of found material, found maps. I had newspaper cuttings, and Ryan was like, Suchitra, it's not going to work. we really want people to be invested in the text, and this is going to make the book heavy. You already have photographs. So they were honest enough to let me know if something is not going to work. And they did that in a way that still allowed me to tell the story. I'm immensely grateful for my editor in India, because I think she had, apart from being structurally making sure that these books sound well for both these very different audiences, she had the harder time to fight for a book like this. I don't think any other editor would have published a book like this. I said, I'm going to hold on to Indian administered Kashmir. And she said, you know what? Yeah, if that's what you want, after the revocation of Article 370, to not use the right word would actually be a deceit of those of us writing books. So yeah, it's been, but trust me, I'm not trying to make all of this look very rosy. Publishing and writing is immensely painful, immensely painful. And anyone who's gone through it, I have a 5-year-old, so I've been through childbirth. Childbirth was worse. Trying to publish a book.
Very recent in my own memory, so I'm visibly wincing.
So yeah.
Well, thank you so much to Suchitra for being here. Please go buy her book. I put the link in the chat to the bookshop.org store, and you can support independent bookstores as well. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those amazing questions and bringing your own experience too. It's fascinating to hear about reporting from Bangladesh and the refugee crisis as well. I just want to do a plug very quickly for another SAJA book talk event we have next week with one of our audience members, actually, Anjali and Jeti. She has 2 books out right now, one nonfiction and one fiction. And we're going to talk to her next week. A member, Lakshmi Gandhi, who's a freelance journalist and writes several book reviews all the time, is going to interview her. So tune in for that. And thank you everyone for joining. And we will post the recording as soon as it's done.
Thank you, Maitli.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to do one more plug for Anjali's book. That's it.
Yes, and
do one for yours. There we go. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.